Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations. And to you, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you for your lifetime of dedication to public service.
Thank you.
In response to a question that Senator Ernst asked, you mentioned that we need barriers across the border to deal with drug trafficking. Are you advocating a wall?
Well, I think I'm advocating a system, a barrier system. In some places, and I'd have to find out more about the situation since I last visited the border.
From what you know, or do you believe that a wall would address the concern that you have about drug trafficking?
Well, a wall certainly would, but in some places it may not be necessary to have, what most people imagine as a wall.
Are you aware that most of the drugs coming into the United States, in particular through Mexico, are entering through ports of entry?
Yes, but they also come elsewhere, and so do illegal immigrants cross the border. And
but
basically,
in particular on the subject of drug trafficking, are you aware that most of the drugs that are trafficked into the United States enter through points of entry?
yes.
Have you recently or ever visited a point of entry, a port of entry?
Not
the United States?
Not recently.
When
I
was
used
the
to
last
spend
time?
a lot of time, well, when I was Attorney General,
So a couple decades ago.
almost 30 years.
Okay. I'd urge you to visit again if and when you are confirmed. I think you'll see that a lot has changed over the years. Given status quo on marijuana and the fact that 10 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized marijuana, and given that the status quo is what it is, and as you rightly described, we have federal laws and then there are various states that have different laws. If confirmed, are you intending to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in the states that have legalized marijuana?
No, I thought I answered that by saying that to the extent people are complying with the state laws, in distribution and production and so forth, we're not going to go after that.
Okay.
But I do feel we can't stay in the current situation because, if you can imagine any kind of situation, can an existing administration and an attorney general start cutting deals with states to say, well, we're not going to apply the federal law, some gun law or some other thing, and say, we're not going to apply it in your state.
I appreciate your point, but specifically, and I appreciate you answering the question, you do not intend to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in those states or in the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana.
That's right, but I think the Congress of the United States, it's incumbent on the Congress to regularize, make a decision as to whether we're going to have a federal system or whether it's going to be, a central federal law, because this is breeding disrespect for the federal law.
I agree with you. I believe Congress should act. I agree. Earlier today, Senator Leahy asked whether you would follow the recommendation of career Department of Justice ethics officials on whether you should recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation. You said, quote, "I will seek the advice of the career ethics personnel, but under the regulations, I make the decisions as the head of the agency as to my own recusal." You also said to Senator Klobuchar that you do not want to, quote, "abdicate your duty," since recusal decision would be yours. So my question is, would it be appropriate to go against the advice of career ethics officials that have recommended recusal? And can you give an example of under what situation or scenario you would go against their recommendation that you recuse yourself?
Well, there are different kinds of recusals. Some are mandated, for example, if you have a financial interest, but there are others that are judgment calls. And
let's imagine it's a judgment call, and the judgment by the career ethics officials in the agency are that you recuse yourself. Under what scenario would you not follow their recommendation?
If I disagreed with it.
And what would the basis of that disagreement be?
I came to a different judgment.
On what basis?
The facts.
Such as?
Such as whatever facts are relevant to the recusal.
What do you imagine the facts would be that are relevant to the recusal?
They could be innumerable. I mean, there are a lot of, for example, there's a rule of necessity, like who else would be handling it. It could be.
Do you believe that would be a concern in this situation if you are if the recommendation is that you recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation? Do you believe that would be a concern, that there'd be no one left to do the job?
Well, in some contexts there very well might be because of you know, who's confirmed for what and who's in what position. But apart from that, it's a judgment call, and the Attorney General is the person who makes the judgment, and that's what the job entails.
As a general matter, that's true, but specifically on this issue, under what scenario would you imagine that you would not follow the recommendation of the career ethics officials in the Department of Justice to recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation?
If I disagreed with them.
Okay. We'll move on. Senator Feinstein previously asked you whether you'd put your June 2018 memo, whether you put together that memo based on non-public information. Your response was that you, quote, did not rely on confidential information. Are you creating a distinction between non-public information and confidential information?
No.
Okay. In response to a question from Senator Durbin about harsh sentencing laws, you stated in response to the crack epidemic that community leaders, back when you were Attorney General previously, asked for these types of sentencing laws. Now, my understanding is that many of these community leaders at that time, and I was a young prosecutor during those days, knew and said even then that the crack epidemic was a public health crisis, and that was really the chorus coming from community leaders, not that they wanted drug-addicted people to be locked up. And similarly, now we can find that in most of the communities afflicted by the opioid crisis, they are similarly, these community leaders, asking that it be addressed for the public health crisis that it is. So my question is, if and when you are confirmed in this position, would you agree that when we talk about the opioid crisis, the crisis in terms of methamphetamine addiction or any other controlled substance, that we should also acknowledge the public health ramifications and causes, and that there is a role for the chief law enforcement officer of the United States to play in advocating for a public health response and not only a lock-em-up response?
Well, I think the commission that was chaired by Governor Chris Christie came up with a three-pronged strategy. And I think that recognized that part of it was treatment and education, recovery, and prevention. But the third prong of it was enforcement and interdiction, and that's the job of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice can't be all things to all people.
Sir, but I would suggest to you that in the intervening almost 30 years since you were last Attorney General, that there is consensus in the United States that when we look at the drug epidemic, whatever the narcotic may be, that there's now an understanding that the war on drugs was an abject failure, that America, frankly, has a crisis of addiction, and that putting the limited resources of our federal government into locking up people who suffer from a public health crisis is probably not the smartest use of taxpayer dollars. So if confirmed, I'd ask that you take a look at the more recent perspective on the drug crisis that is afflicting our country. And then I'll move on. Today, there is $1 billion.
Can I just say something in response to that?
Sure.
Which is, I was just making the observation that the job of the Department of Justice is enforcement. I recognize there are a lot of dimensions to the problem, and that's why we have places like HHS. The department can't do the job of everybody.
Sir, but I would remind you what you said, because I agree with it. You said earlier the role of the Attorney General, one, is to enforce the rule of law, two, is a legal advisor to the President and the Cabinet, and three is policy. Mm-hmm. This is a policy issue, so I'd urge you to emphasize that role and power that you will have if confirmed, and think of it that way.
I see.
I'd like to talk with you about private prisons. There's a $1 billion private prison industry that profits off of incarcerating people, and frankly, as many as possible. By one estimate, the two largest private prison companies in the United States make a total combined profit of $3.3 billion. That's what it'd be, dollars a year. In August of 2016, the Justice Department issued a report on the Bureau of Prisons' use of private prisons that concluded, quote, contract prisons incurred more safety and security incidents per capita than comparable Bureau of Prisons institutions. Given this conclusion that prisons run by for-profit companies have been found to be less safe than government-run prisons, if confirmed, will you commit to no longer renew private prison contracts?
Whose report was this? BOP?
This was, yes, from the Justice Department.
Yeah, I'd like to, I would obviously look at that report. yes.
Okay, and then...
But I'm not committing, I mean, I'd want to see what the report says.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then I'd appreciate a follow-up when you have a chance to read
Sure.
it. Thank you. My time's up.